They had every reason to hate them. Months of starvation, humiliation, and beatings had turned those American prisoners into walking ghosts. Yet when fate flipped the battlefield, and their German captors lay wounded, helpless, and hunted by advancing Soviet troops, something unthinkable happened. Instead of vengeance, the Americans chose mercy. They carried the very men who had once locked them behind barbed wire, shielding them from certain death. Under a sky filled with smoke and vengeance, these POWs made a choice that defied war itself. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't duty. It was humanity, raw, fragile, and powerful enough to silence the roar of hatred. This is the forgotten story of American prisoners who risked execution to protect their enemies, a moment when compassion became the bravest act of all. It was April 1945, the world was collapsing. Germany's once mighty war machine was crumbling, the Allies closing in from the west, and the Soviets burning their way from the east. Inside a small prison camp hidden in the Bavarian hills, a group of American POWs waited for their fate. Starved, exhausted, and broken, they had endured months of cruelty at the hands of their German guards. But as the front lines shifted, the power dynamic reversed. The guards, terrified of Soviet retribution, suddenly found themselves prisoners of circumstance, unarmed, desperate, and facing certain death. For the Americans, this was the moment of reckoning. They could have walked away. They could have let their captors face the vengeance they had earned. But what they did instead shocked history. They stood between their captors and death itself. This isn't a tale of nations or victory. It's a story about morality in the ruins of war, when compassion became an act of rebellion. The air inside the camp was thick with fear, not from the Americans this time, but from their German guards. The distant thunder of Soviet artillery echoed across the horizon, each explosion a reminder that the end was closing in. The Red Army's reputation preceded them, brutal, relentless, and hungry for revenge. To them, a German uniform meant guilt, and mercy was a word long forgotten. Captain Edward Donaldson, an American officer held prisoner for nearly a year, watched the panic spread through the camp like wildfire. The same guards who once barked orders now trembled, whispering about the massacres that awaited them if the Soviets arrived first. He had seen the shift in their eyes, pride turning into terror. For weeks, the Americans had been surviving on scraps, patching wounds with filthy rags, and dreaming of home. Yet, in those final days of the war, their dreams mixed with something darker, the sight of their captors, stripped of power, facing a punishment even they didn't deserve. One morning, as dawn broke over the camp, a German sergeant, once feared by all, collapsed near the gate. His face was pale, his leg torn open by shrapnel from a nearby blast. Donaldson and two other POWs rushed to his side, not with hatred, but instinct. They tore their shirts to make bandages, stopping the bleeding as the man muttered "Danke" under his breath, the first word of gratitude ever spoken between them. In that moment, the walls of war cracked. The Americans began to see the Germans not as monsters, but as men, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Some guards confessed they never wanted this war, others spoke of families they hadn't seen in years. The POWs listened, silently realizing that suffering wore the same face, no matter the uniform. Rumors soon reached the camp that Soviet tanks were less than 2 days away. The German officers knew what that meant: execution without trial. They begged the Americans to flee, to save themselves before it was too late. But the Americans saw something else, a chance to prove that compassion could survive even here, in the ashes of humanity. As the sun set on that final day, the prisoners and their former captors shared one last meal: thin soup, a few crumbs of bread, and a silence heavy with fear. None of them knew what the next sunrise would bring, but one thing was certain: choices would be made that night, choices that would define their souls forever. Night fell over the camp like a black curtain, swallowing what little hope remained. The faint rumble of tanks echoed in the distance, Soviet armor rolling through the shattered German countryside. Each minute brought them closer. Inside the barracks, the Americans sat in silence, their faces lit only by the flickering glow of a dying lantern. For months, they had dreamed of liberation. But freedom now stood on the edge of a knife, tangled in a choice none of them could have imagined. Captain Donaldson leaned against the wall, staring at his worn boots. Across from him sat Sergeant William Hayes, a wiry man from Kansas who had once sworn that if he ever got the chance, he'd put a bullet in every Kraut alive. Yet now, even Hayes looked uneasy. "They'll kill them," Hayes muttered, his voice low. "Every one of them." Donaldson didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what was coming. The Soviets were famous for what they did to German soldiers, and to anyone seen helping them. From outside came a desperate knock. One of the guards, a young German barely 20, stumbled in. His face was smeared with soot, his hands trembling. He dropped to his knees. "Bit, help us," he said in broken English. "They come soon. Kill all. Please." A long silence followed. The Americans exchanged glances, torn between fury and pity. This was the same man who had shouted orders, who had pointed a rifle at them every morning. And now, he was begging for his life. Donaldson rose slowly. "You're asking us to protect you," he said, disbelief in his voice. The German nodded, tears streaking the dirt on his face. "I have wife, baby. I do not want to die." Outside, the wind howled through the broken fences, carrying with it the distant thunder of war. The world was collapsing, and inside this tiny prison, the line between enemy and friend had blurred beyond recognition. That night, the Americans gathered to decide. Some wanted to turn the Germans over to the Soviets, to let them face the justice they deserved. Others argued that mercy, even for an enemy, was what made them human. Hayes slammed his fist on the table. "Mercy," he barked. "After what they did to us? You call that mercy?" Donaldson met his eyes. "If we do nothing, we become them," he said quietly. "We've already lost enough of ourselves in this war." The room fell silent again. The decision wasn't about politics or orders, it was about conscience. When dawn broke, the choice had been made. The Americans would lead their captors, the wounded, the terrified, the guilty, away from the camp, toward the safety of the advancing American lines. It was madness. If the Soviets found them helping German soldiers, they'd all be executed on the spot. But they went anyway. They tore up old bedsheets to make bandages, used wooden planks as stretchers, and gathered what little food they had left. There were no orders, no plans, just men doing what felt right in the ruins of a broken world. As they moved out, the forest around them seemed alive with tension. Smoke from burning villages drifted through the air, and every echo sounded like death closing in. The Germans, once proud and commanding, now leaned on the very men they had imprisoned. And the Americans, frail, starving, but resolute, carried them through the darkness. Hours later, they reached a crossroads littered with the wreckage of war, abandoned carts, shattered helmets, and the bodies of those who hadn't made it. A distant explosion shook the ground, and a flash lit the sky behind them. "Keep moving," Donaldson ordered, his voice steady though his legs trembled. "We're almost there." Behind him, the German sergeant limped, clutching his side. He looked at Donaldson and whispered, why do you help us?" Donaldson didn't look back. "Because someone has to stop the hate," he said. "It has to end somewhere." By the time they reached the river, the final barrier before the American lines, the sound of Soviet engines roared behind them. The Americans pushed the Germans forward, shouting for them to cross first. Bullets began to whistle through the trees. One German stumbled and fell, crying out in pain. Hayes, the same man who had sworn vengeance, ran back through the gunfire, dragging him to safety. When they finally made it across, the first American patrol appeared on the opposite bank, rifles raised in confusion. To them, it looked like a group of German soldiers advancing, until they saw the ragged uniforms of the POWs shielding them. Donaldson fell to his knees, gasping, as the chaos subsided. He looked around at the faces of the men, American and German alike, alive, trembling, and human. For a moment, no one spoke. War had taken everything from them, their strength, their dignity, their innocence. But in that act of mercy, they reclaimed something the war could never destroy, their humanity. The forest was on fire. Not from flames, but from war. Soviet shells screamed overhead, bursting in the distance like thunderclaps. Trees shattered, the ground trembled, and the sky glowed an angry red. The Americans pressed forward through the chaos, dragging their wounded and the terrified Germans toward the riverbank. Every second was a gamble. They knew that if the Soviets spotted them together, Americans and Germans side by side, there would be no questions, no mercy. They would all be cut down where they stood. Captain Donaldson stumbled through the mud, his hands raw from carrying the injured. Behind him, Sergeant Hayes struggled to support the German sergeant who could barely walk. The man's uniform, once a symbol of power, was now torn and bloodied. The roar of engines grew louder. Soviet half-tracks appeared at the far end of the valley, their headlights slicing through the smoke. Shouts echoed in Russian. Orders. Warnings. Death on the move. Get down. Donaldson hissed. The men dove behind a fallen tree trunk as tracer fire ripped through the air, snapping branches and spraying dirt. The Americans huddled close, the Germans clutching their helmets, waiting for the inevitable. Hayes looked at Donaldson, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't run forever," he said. "They'll see us." Donaldson's mind raced. If they were discovered, every man here would die, including the ones they were trying to save. And yet, the thought of abandoning the Germans felt impossible now. Somewhere along this journey, the enemy had become human. He looked around, a shattered cart lay nearby, half buried in mud, its wheels still intact. An idea sparked. "We'll use it," he said. "Get the wounded inside. We move through the smoke, stay low. If we reach the river, we're safe." No one argued. They moved like ghosts, silent and desperate, pushing the cart through the broken forest. The sounds of gunfire grew fainter as the Soviets pushed west, hunting German survivors elsewhere. For a moment, it seemed as if fate was giving them a chance. Then, a voice shattered the silence. "Stoy! Stop!" 3 Soviet soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles raised. Their eyes darted between the uniforms, American khaki and German gray. Confusion flickered for only a second before one shouted something in Russian, his finger tightening on the trigger. Donaldson stepped forward, hands raised high. "Amerikansky," he yelled. "U.S. Army. Prisoners of war." The Soviet paused, suspicion etched on his face. One of the Germans coughed, blood spattering the ground. The soldier's gaze hardened. He raised his rifle again. And then, in a moment of pure instinct, Hayes moved. He stepped between the Soviets and the Germans, spreading his arms wide. "No," he shouted. "They're unarmed." For a heartbeat, time froze. The Soviets hesitated, their eyes flicking between the 2 Americans. The forest crackled with gunfire in the distance, but here, all was still, the air heavy with the weight of a single decision. Finally, the Soviet officer lowered his weapon. He spoke quietly to his men, and after a tense pause, they turned away. The danger had passed, barely. Donaldson felt his knees give out, the tension draining from his body. Hayes exhaled shakily, looking at the Germans, those same men who had once called him animal, now staring at him with tears in their eyes. No words were needed. In that moment, every wall built by hatred collapsed. As dawn broke over the river, they crossed together, soldiers and prisoners, enemies and saviors, bound by something far stronger than fear. Behind them, the war still raged. Ahead lay freedom, but also the memory of what they had done, and the truth that would haunt them forever, that mercy, in war, is the most dangerous act of all. By the time the sun rose, the war had changed hands. The sounds of battle faded into the distance, replaced by the cautious silence of survival. On the far side of the river, American forces finally reached them, a patrol from the 45th Infantry Division, weary and battle-hardened. At first, the soldiers didn't understand what they were seeing, American POWs escorting a line of wounded German guards. Some raised their rifles, unsure which side to point at. It took several tense minutes before Captain Donaldson, his voice hoarse and trembling, managed to explain. "They were our captors," he said. "Now they're our responsibility." The officer in charge, a lieutenant barely older than 20, stared in disbelief. He'd seen cruelty, revenge, the darkness of war, but never this. After a moment, he lowered his weapon. "Get them food and water," he ordered. "All of them." That night, the men rested in a makeshift field camp. The Germans lay alongside the Americans, wrapped in shared blankets, no longer enemies, just survivors. For the first time in months, the air was free of fear. A German sergeant, his leg still bound by a torn American shirt, whispered to Hayes, "Why did you save us?" Hayes stared into the campfire, his face lit by orange light. "Because if I didn't," he said softly, "I'd still be your prisoner." In the days that followed, the POWs were debriefed and sent home. Their story spread quietly through military channels, but it never made the headlines. The world, hungry for tales of victory and vengeance, had little interest in a story about compassion. Years later, Donaldson wrote in his journal, "We were soldiers once, captives, enemies, men stripped of everything. But on that day, by saving those we were taught to hate, we became free in a way war could never take from us." The act went unrecorded in official histories, buried beneath statistics and medals. Yet among those who lived it, the memory endured, a small, defiant flame in the endless shadow of war. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't over the enemy. It's over the hate inside ourselves. War teaches men to hate, to see the world in black and white, enemy and ally, life and death. But every so often, in the ashes of destruction, humanity dares to flicker back to life. The story of those American POWs is proof of that, proof that even when surrounded by darkness, compassion can still find its way through. They had no orders to follow, no medals to earn, no witnesses to applaud them. What they did was dangerous, senseless even, in the logic of war. But in the logic of the heart, it was everything. When they chose mercy over vengeance, they rewrote the meaning of victory. They reminded the world that being human isn't about who wins or loses, it's about who we become when no one is watching. Those German captors survived because the men they once imprisoned refused to let hate dictate their fate. And in doing so, those Americans reclaimed something the war had nearly destroyed, their souls. History may not remember their names, but the echo of their choice still lingers, whispering through the ruins of time. That in war, courage is not only found on the battlefield. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet decision to forgive. Because when the guns fall silent and the flags are lowered, what remains isn't who killed whom. It's who dared to show kindness when the world had forgotten what that meant.